bail a few family members, obviously. Mr. Brown, further arguments for the defense?
Yes, sir. Good morning. This case is about a family. And this case is absolutely tragic. Everything about this case is heartbreaking. But this is not a case of first-degree murder. We admit that Nate was the one who shot and killed Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. We admit he is the one who shot and harmed LaTanya. We have never denied that. But this is not a case of premeditated and deliberate murder. Nate did not go to the Taylor's home in Lake Ladd Road with the intent of killing anybody. When he got there, there was a perfect storm of events that caused him to snap, to go into a rage, and to act in a way that was out of character, completely out of character for him. He was not acting in a cool state of mind. Nothing that Ms. Hamburger and I are saying here today in any way is intended to diminish what happened to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. We are not trying to belittle what LaTanya has had to go through. And yes, we acknowledge the pain all of this has caused JT, Nautica, and Amber. But the question here is whether or not Nate Holden is guilty of first-degree murder. And the state is trying to prove that. And one of the ways they are trying to prove that he is guilty of first-degree murder is through the theory of premeditation and deliberation. As we talked about in jury selection, to prove somebody guilty of murder under that theory, the state has to do more than simply show that he was the one who shot and killed the victims. They have to show premeditation and they have to show deliberation. What is deliberation? It means that the defendant acted when he was in a cool state of mind. If a person is under the influence of some suddenly aroused violent passion, then there is no deliberation. There is not that cold-blooded necessity for deliberation for it to be that type of murder. And as tragic and as sad as these events are, and we can all agree about how tragic and sad they are. This was not a premeditated and deliberate killing. When you get the instructions, one of the things from Judge Ridgway in a few minutes, he's going to tell you is that you can look in deciding premeditation and deliberation at what happened before the crime, during the crime, and after the crime to see what the deliberation was there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those areas, help show there was no deliberation here. It was not an acting in a cool state of mind. Ms. Hamburger talked a lot about what happened before April 9th, and I'm not going to go and repeat all of that. I'm going to hit a couple points about it. There was obviously some disputes between LaTanya and Nate before this, but as she mentioned, this is not a stalker situation. This was not something out of some type of Lifetime movie. This was a family that had a dispute in early January, but as you heard LaTanya testify, this was not a case of him stalking her in the months beforehand at all. You heard about the text messages that they returned, the phone calls. Text messages included things like getting the kids medicine back and forth. There was not an inordinate of calls in the weeks leading up before. What were they talking about, generally? They were talking about things that co-parents would have to talk about taking care of the kids, making arrangements for the children. You did not hear evidence of a violent, homicidal man in Nate Holden before April 9th. What you heard is of a family that was having problems with their marriages, but what was one of the key things that she said why the marriage broke up? They had problems, and they sounded like the type of problems that would end marriages. But one of the final straws was that he basically had blown off their anniversary. And that can be a final straw in a lot of marriages. But it does not show this typical controlling thing that you might have thought coming into this case you were going to see. What you had was a man who was hardly perfect in Nate, but a man who did love his family and care about him and showed no evidence of the violence that you saw on April 9th. This was not a case where everything sort of accumulated and it was a final graduation of something, of a violent event after a violent event. This was uncharacteristic. This was something different. But on the other hand, and the other part about it is, there were things that were happening, and the things that led to that perfect storm that caused Nate to snap. Nate was upset about the separation, and it was causing him stress, it was causing him sadness, it was causing him depression. It's understandable. I mean, he and LaTanya had been together since they were 14. Since he was 14 years old, she was 15 years old. He had never, at 30 years old, he had never gone through a breakup before. And this one was especially hard for him. He was sad. He was depressed. It was causing stress. People said his family meant everything to him. And some of the things to consider what happened beforehand was his relationship with Sylvester and Sylvester's volatile nature. It is important to understand what happened on April 9th. to recognize that Sylvester had a volatile nature and that Nate and him had always had a bad relationship. People testified from both sides that Sylvester had a temper, and that there had been threats by Sylvester against Nate, and that Sylvester never liked Nate. And all of that came into play on April 9th. And Ms. Hamburger talked a lot, and Mr. Waller mentioned it too, the January 26th incident with JT and Sylvester. That is an important event because of what it meant in Nate's mind on April 9th. There's been mixed testimony about whether or not Sylvester had a gun that night. There's certainly, but what is clear is this. JT reported that Sylvester had a gun, reported it to several people, and that's what Nate heard, that's what Nate believed, and that was a reasonable belief under the circumstances. Just a quick reminder of what exactly happened in the event and where it would stand where any parent hearing this information and how they would go ahead and feel. There was a custody exchange. Apparently there was a tense moment between Nate and Sylvester, as we've heard. They had a lot of tense moments. But then Jeremy's report was that his grandfather began screaming at him, "You set me up, you set me up," and used a racial slur. And then he slapped him. Then he came out with a gun and a belt. Sylvester did have a gun. Mr. Taylor did have a gun in the car that night. That is actually not in dispute. He showed he denies pulling the gun, but he did have a bag in the car which had a gun. He showed Kathy Sudhall that bag, gun. And basically, Mr. Taylor admitted that most of the story was the same as what JT said. He did admit that he was screaming at this 14-year-old kid that "you set me up." Oh. The important thing, though, about all of this is what Nate heard happened. And yes, it was going to have an effect on him. And when Kathy Sudhall came and told him, investigated about it, you heard a reaction. Mr. Holden could not be satisfied about anything. He's just really upset. And I told him if he's going to do something, well, then get a protective order. So get an emergency order for custody. And that's what he did. He did it. He got a lawyer, despite his limited finances. He went ahead and he got emergency custody because he thought that was the best thing for his kids. And yes, it is true. The other thing is, Nate knew that Mr. Taylor had guns in his home, and that he had a history of having guns. Now, it is true that there was a court order and an agreement that the Taylors remove the guns from the home. And apparently they did. But at that hearing, keep in mind that Kathy Sudhall said, at the hearing that Nate was at about the custody hearing, Kathy Sudhall said, they told me they had removed the guns, but she's not a law enforcement officer. No, it was Ms. Haddix. They couldn't do a search of the house. Nate was basically relying on on Mr. Taylor having been honest with them about removing the guns. And given his relationship, the tension and everything else, that was something that he wasn't going to believe. And there's the events of the birthday party that happened on April 5th, where two things, where they had the birthday party. LaTanya was originally going to come help bring things for the birthday party, but and this is, be clear about this, no one is blaming her for a second for not coming to the party or anything else. I think we all know situations where you don't want to be with your ex-spouse or ex-significant other of any type at a party. And for her not going, but it did mean two important things to the story. One, that she had not seen Jeremy since his birthday, and two, it was something that increased the stress and sadness of Nate during that time. Now, as I get to talk about what happened that day on April 9th, I want to acknowledge that there was a lot of things, clearly, that Nate did wrong before he even got to the house, or when he got to the house that day, before anybody was shot. Yes, he should not have gone to the house in Lake Glad Road in violation of a restraining order. Absolutely. That was wrong. It is, I point out, and it goes out, I think, to the fact that how unusual this was, that this was apparently the first time he had ever violated that aspect of the restraining order and had gone to that house or place of work or anywhere inappropriate to see LaTanya since the restraining order had been issued. And yes, he shouldn't have had a gun because the protective order said he was supposed to get rid of guns. But unfortunately, we all know that simply the judge writing that into an order does not get people to automatically get rid of the guns. Nate had a gun. You had heard testimony about that he had a gun that he kept at his house, and that he often kept that gun in the car. Doug Carroll testified to that. Nobody contradicted that. Nobody's been able to say that Nate got rid of his guns after that protective order because Nate still had his gun. And the gun that he had was the gun that Doug Carroll had sold him years ago. And especially, Nate should not have gone to that house where he knew Mr. Taylor was likely to be, given the tension between their two relationships, the volatility of it all. All of that we acknowledge was wrong. It was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. But now, these are not the issues in this case. The issue is, did he, when he went there, act with premeditation and deliberation? And he did not. That's what he should be judged on. And in making this judgment and deciding what happened, you heard in this trial two very powerful witnesses, LaTanya and JT. And without a doubt, their testimony was moving and it was sincere. And we talk about how much you should rely on it. We're not suggesting that they are lying or making up or trying to frame anybody. What we are suggesting is that there may be details that either they were incapable of knowing because of their location or because of the traumatic effects of what happened would have on anybody's witnesses. And what we're talking about a lot is details. We understand that the essence of what they said, that this horrible crime happened, and that Nate was the one who came in and did these shootings. We recognize that all of that is true. But when you look at the details and look at what their memory is and the ability to recall, and that's one of your most important responsibilities as a jurist, you got to keep in mind some things. First of all, much of what happened, in fact, everything that happened with Mr. and Mrs. Taylor happened in another room where LaTanya and JT were, and that's going to affect their ability to recount exactly what happened, what they heard, what happened when the confrontation originally began. But there's also going to be things that time, but probably more in this case, trauma, are going to affect a person's ability to recall. LaTanya says that everything with the assault happened in one room. And she's being sincere and truthful when she says that, but the physical evidence shows otherwise. And that's important because it helps show, and that's not something she's doing to help one side or the other. So she honestly doesn't remember. And she doesn't remember because of what she went through. The trauma, everything else. That means there's going to be things about what she says that are going to be inaccurate. Same with JT. And although, thank goodness, he didn't suffer any physical injuries, he too went through a traumatic event, and there's going to be memories, and there's going to be times that time is going to come in and fill in details. And some of his things that he has said have changed over the years. For instance, he talked about the fact that his dad went and picked up a bag in the woods right before this happened. Now, I want to point out that he never saw what was inside the bag, doesn't know what it is. It makes absolutely no sense for any argument that it was somehow a gun with it. The gun that Nate used in this was the gun that had been sold to him before the crime, that he had. Witnesses, you even heard the girls talk about, one of the girls in the video talked about the fact that he had a gun beforehand. He had a gun beforehand. But JT never mentioned anything about a bag to the officers when they first interviewed him. Never mentioned it until weeks before this trial for the first time. That's a sign. Sometimes memory come over. When you heard different talks about a story, he gave different timeline events about what happened. When he was first interviewed, after it happened, he forgot or left out what happened at the church that night. He was reminded about the events and all and came around to it and all, but it's different stories, and there are different places throughout it. Both of them get facts wrong. Again, it is not a criticism of them. It is a fact to take into consideration. There are going to be details of what happened that they get wrong. So what really happened that night? And I'm going to tell you what I believe that the evidence shows, and I'm going to then show you why I believe that happened. I'll show you why the evidence does support that. Nate was upset that LaTanya had missed a birthday party, and that he was upset. And keeping in mind, this is consistent, we talked about families beforehand, that she didn't see Jeremy hadn't had a chance to see her on her birthday. And Nate also missed LaTanya. How do we know? Okay. Wait. So he goes to the house, and one of the big intentions there is so that Jeremy will have a chance to see his mom. And he waits in the car. And Sylvester comes out of the door where he just let Jeremy in, and he confronts Nate, and the two of them get into an argument, like they have beforehand and all.
I'm going to allow counsel to describe what he believes reasonable inferences from the evidence are. Overruled.
Yes. And during the argument, they get close. And then this is a combination of events. From that argument, from the history of their relationship, from everything else that Nate comes over, he snaps. He loses it. He goes into a rage. A combination of the sadness over the breakup, his fear and anger towards Sylvester overtakes him, and in an absolute rage, without deliberation, he begins shooting Mr. Taylor. And this rage lasts from the time he finished shooting Mr. Taylor through the shooting of Mrs. Taylor, all the way through the beating and shooting of Latanya. So how do we know this happened? What is the evidence that proves that this is the scenario that happened that day without any witnesses? Go over a little bit the evidence that supports that this is what happened. Nate did want Jeremy to be able to see his mom after his birthday. And we know that for things that happened the day beforehand. If you remember, Latanya talked about the text that she was sending him the day beforehand about trying to arrange for Jeremy to be able to see her the day beforehand because he was missing her the birthday. Latanya said, "I can't do it today. I've got a lot of things at work." That was the day beforehand. But this is not memory or anything else. This was a text that she remembered from the stand. It did happen. The birthday thing was not something that was just made up that day. It happened. And when he couldn't reach her during the day, and there is one text from Nate to Latanya that day asking to talk, which was apparently not returned. She said that she called a few times at work. It makes sense that he was trying to rearrange going back there. When Nate came to the church where Latanya would most likely be, if the theory was correct that he was just planning to go in the whole time and just shoot her, shoot different people and all, and that he was running as soon as he got there, that would have been more likely when he got to the church, thinking he was there, he could have ran in there immediately and have done that. But he did, which is what the plan was going to be when he was at the home, was to stay in the car and see if she got out, but at least Jeremy would have a chance to see her. Because normally, Latanya would have been at the church. So he stays in the car at the time. Doesn't get out of the car. When Jeremy comes in and says she's not there, she's at home, they go back. So Sylvester is at the doorway when Nate comes and Jeremy come in. When Jeremy comes to the door, who lets him in? Sylvester. And everything we know about the relationship between Sylvester and Nate suggests that once he saw that Nate was there in his yard, where he was not supposed to be, in which we acknowledge he was not supposed to be, Mr. Taylor was going to go up to that car and he was going to confront Nate. And that was going to be into an argument. And how do we know that the confrontation first started in the front yard? Well, we also have physical evidence that shows that too. And that has to do with the shell casings that were found. And you heard a lot of evidence about shell casings in different locations and all. So let me just talk a little bit about that and why it shows that probably the original shots were fired outside in the front yard when the two had their confrontation. Mrs. Taylor was shot once in the master bedroom. There's one shell casing in the master bedroom. LaTanya was shot once in the heart. There's also evidence of at least a bullet being shot, possibly grazing, or the doctors believe hitting her mouth, and they found a second shell casing in that room. So one was found, and there's two shell casings in that part of the house. Only 2 other shell casings are found in the house. One in the living room and one in the backyard. But Mr. Taylor was shot 4 times. We know that the house and the backyard were searched thoroughly. In fact, they used a metal detector in the backyard. That's how they found one of the shell casings. But they didn't use any such metal detector in the front yard. There are 2 shell casings missing. We put almost nothing about a search in the front yard. Obviously, we saw lots of vehicles, lots of people coming through, medical help and everything else that could have affected the finding of it anyway in the front yard. But the lack of thorough search, the shell casings, they had to be somewhere. They were in the front yard because that's where the confrontation took place. And we heard the medical examiner testify. He talked about soot and stippling. And I think if you remember what that is the idea that normally they cannot tell how far a distance are. So somebody is shot 6 feet away or 12 feet away. They're not going to be able to tell that. Medical science can't do that. But if there's soot and stippling on a wound, that's a sign that it was from close range, a few inches to a few feet. There's only one wound that Mr. Taylor had that had soot and stippling on it. And it's the one that's right here to the side of his left side. It suggests the most likely of a confrontation of some type coming when the first shot is fired. I'm not saying that that is self-defense. That's not saying that that is justified. But it says that it more suggests the result of an argument that caused a violent reaction, that caused him to, with everything else, to cause him to snap, to go into the rage, and to not act in a cool state. every description that we did here about what happened during that time, every description of that is not of somebody acting in a cool state of mind. It is of somebody acting in a violent rage. The actions of a man who has snapped. He is screaming, he is yelling, he's acting out of control. He's acting totally different than he has acted beforehand. This is nothing compared to what happened in LaTonya's description on January 2nd. This is a man with everything else happening and all. He's not acting with deliberation. Mr. Holden's actions afterwards show the opposite of someone who acted with premeditation and deliberation. He made no effort to hide or get away with his crime. What did he do after he finished hitting LaTonya, after he was shot? He called 911, gave the phone to his children, hugged them, told them he loved them, and he left his wallet behind where his identity would be, not that it would have been in dispute anyway with who was there, but assured that there would be no doubt who was responsible for that. He drove his truck to a house of somebody and called Doug Carroll. He had no plan to get away because he hadn't thought this through, never thought it through, because he wasn't acting with premeditation. He wasn't acting with deliberation. And his final words to both that Doug Carroll heard in his phone call to his dad was, "Take care of my kids." This was not the act of a cold-blooded murderer. This was someone who snapped. This is from the stress of someone who was dealing with the stress from the only relationship he ever knew. It finally got to him. The volatility of his relationship with Mr. Taylor, and everything combined to cause a violent rage. And he acted totally out of character for him. The state has not proven that he acted with premeditation. They certainly have not proven he's acted with deliberation. Do not find him guilty of first-degree murder. He is not guilty of first-degree murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Lively, final argument on behalf of the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. This case is not about a family. It's about 2 counts of first-degree murder. It's about 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. And it's about 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon with the intent to kill to inflict serious injury. Now, of course, the family is a part of it. They're the victims. LaTonya Allen is here, miraculously, and Sylvester Taylor and Anglia Taylor are no longer with us. So, in that sense, I suppose it's about a family, but it's about the defendant, Nathan Holden, and what he did. And you heard someone say that this was not Nate Holden, but we are the sum of our actions. Nathan Holden did this. This is Nathan Holden. And you heard that they say it's out of character. Well, murder is out of character for most people. Murdering two people is not something that is a habit or is done in the regular course of business. But if it happens, you need to decide why from the facts and the evidence. And I also want to tell you what we don't have to prove and what we don't care to prove. We don't care to prove he's a monster or that he was a bad person on every other day or that his children didn't love him. Not because that might not be important in phase 2, because it's irrelevant to your deliberations and your determination of guilt or innocence to these crimes. Now, the defense spoke for about an hour, and they talked a little bit about deliberation, and they talked a little bit about intent, and they talked a lot about stuff that happened before April 9th. But this is all about what happened on April 9th, and you haven't heard any law from them. And that's because it is overwhelmingly against the defendant. The law is clear on this. This is first-degree murder, both to Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Taylor, and attempted murder to LaTanya Allen, as well as the felony assault. And, in so much as they have talked about the bad blood between Sylvester, and I got to give credit to Mr. Waller. He got it exactly right. They're blaming the victim because the defendant wants to evade responsibility for the choices he made and the actions he took over a period of time on April 9th. But the amazing thing is all of that, all of the arguments they made, the evidence they presented is evidence of motive. It's evidence of premeditation, it's evidence of deliberation, and it's evidence of malice. Now, none of those terms have been defined for you, again, because the law is overwhelmingly against the defendant. And because the defense doesn't have to prove anything to you. We have the burden of proof as to each element. You remember this from jury selection. We talked about it a lot, that the state must satisfy you to each element of the crimes and satisfy you beyond a reasonable doubt for you to find the defendant guilty. We've been talking about a lot of context, red herrings to make you think this case is about something different than what it is. The judge is going to instruct you on the law in a minute, but I have the burden of proving this case to you at this point, and so I want to talk about the law because what you do as jurors is you listen to the evidence, you follow the law as the judge instructs you, and you apply the facts to the law. That is the function of the juror. You've done part one. You've listened to the evidence. We thank you for that. We see you've been taking notes, asking questions. We know you've been diligent in that. It would be irresponsible for us not to give you a full and correct statement of what the law is in this case. And again, this is a State v. Holden, 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, and 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill, inflicting serious injury. I'm gonna work backwards here a little bit and start with the least serious crime. You'll understand why in a minute. And again, the defense essentially has made arguments saying that the defendant is not guilty of premeditated and deliberate murder. Okay. They have not said he's not guilty of attempted first-degree murder or first-degree murder under any other theory or the assault on LaTanya Holden because he's guilty. So I think what the judge will instruct you, and it's not because I'm a fortune teller, charge conference, we talk about what the judge is going to instruct you as to the law, but that with regards to LaTanya Holden, assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury, that this is what the state must prove. That on or about the alleged date, April 9th, 2014, the defendant intentionally shot the victim, LaTanya Holden, in the face and chest with a deadly weapon, thereby inflicting serious injury upon her. Now, further paring down what you'll have to deliberate on or decide on, the judge will further instruct you that a firearm is a deadly weapon. I further instruct you that a gunshot wound to the face and the chest are serious injury. These are facts that aren't in dispute. A firearm's a deadly weapon. The defense has admitted. All of the evidence shows you are all fully satisfied and entirely convinced that the defendant shot LaTonya Allen with a deadly weapon, and that she went to the doctor. And I will not insult your intelligence to try and convince you about her serious injuries. The gunshot wound to the chest and to the face are serious injuries, and one of the great miracles of this trial is that LaTonya Holden lived. I think that you heard some of the 3 doctors that performed emergency surgeries on her testify to that, to her strength. So we have proven, and I don't believe it's even something that you're going to need to have a discussion about, that the defendant is guilty of at least assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury. Why am I starting here? Because of the felony murder rule. Okay. And we talked about this, I think, in jury selection. I hope with all of you. I know with most of you we did. And it was explained briefly, but this is what the judge is going to tell you about the felony murder rule. And remember, there are 2 theories of first-degree murder. So this is a first-degree murder conviction. Here's what the state has to prove. That the defendant committed the felony assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury on LaTonya Holden. To establish this element, the state must satisfy you beyond a reasonable doubt that on or about the alleged date, the defendant intentionally shot LaTonya Holden in the face and chest with a deadly weapon, thereby inflicting serious injury on her. A firearm is a deadly weapon, and gunshot wounds to the face and chest are serious injury. This is something that you don't have to debate. Okay? That if he did that and then also killed Sylvester Taylor and Anglia Taylor while that was happening, he's guilty of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule. He's committed a felony there. And the next slide I'm showing you is another, I guess, piece of the law that the judge will further use to explain felony murder to you. It's the continuous transaction doctrine. And it applies to first-degree felony murder when the felony occurs before, during, or soon after the victim's death, so long as the felony and the murder form one continuous transaction. Again, we're relying on you using your reason and common sense. He went over there for one purpose. He committed the 2 murders and the felony assault sort of in the same course of events in a matter of minutes. And it's a continuous transaction. So again, it doesn't matter in terms of timing who he shot first. He shot and killed Sylvester 4 times. He shot Anglia 1 time. And he shot LaTonya 2 times and tried to shoot her a 3rd time. Again, all within a matter of minutes. You apply the continuous transaction doctrine to the felony murder rule. You find that he has committed the felony assault with the deadly weapon on LaTonya. Then you go and you find the defendant guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule for Sylvester Taylor and for Anglia Taylor. And we haven't even talked about premeditation and deliberation yet, and we're already into phase 2. So, again, that's not something you've heard about, but all of the evidence supports it. All we have to show is that he meant to pull the trigger on LaTonya. And again, all the evidence shows that as well. Her blood and DNA is on the gun. Her blood and DNA are on his boots, on his black jeans, on his black hoodie. He meant to pull the trigger and shoot LaTonya. So, next what I would ask you to do is when you get the verdict sheet is to find the defendant guilty of assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injury on LaTonya Holden. It's Allen now, but because of her name at the time, she's going to be referred to as Holden throughout your instructions. And then find him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. So why are we going on? Well, because the judge is going to submit both theories of first-degree murder to you, premeditation and deliberation, and the felony murder rules. So again, we need to go through all of it. But let's finish talking about LaTonya Holden. So attempted first-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill, inflicting serious injury. So I've told you that you only need to find him guilty. We call this the alphabet crime because it's just it looks like a bunch of letters, but it's AWDWIKISI. That's assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill, inflicting serious injury. Now, I haven't talked to you about the IK yet. That's the intent to kill, but we're going to get into that next. I imagine the judge is going to instruct you on that and then say if you have a reasonable doubt about the intent to kill, then you consider assault with a deadly weapon, inflicting serious injury, because that doesn't have the intent to kill requirement. It only has the requirement that he intentionally fired the gun at her and it resulted in serious injury. And some people get confused about the difference between attempted first-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill to inflict serious injury, but they do have different elements. I mean, you could attempt to murder someone by shooting at them, clearly have an intent to kill them and miss them, and they not be injured at all. So these are two different crimes with slightly different elements, but it is bringing us to the I guess the issue and dispute in this trial, and that's intent. What's in the defendant's mind when he commits these crimes. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Now, I'm going to skip ahead for a second and tell you that the judge is going to instruct you about intent. And he'll say intent's a mental attitude seldom provable by direct evidence. By that, it means we can't scan someone's brain and discover its contents or its thoughts. But we can certainly decide what someone was thinking based on the evidence. It must ordinarily be proved by circumstances from which it may be inferred. An intent to kill may be inferred from the nature of the assault, the manner in which it was made, the conduct of the parties, and other relevant circumstances. Now let's get back to LaTonya. Here are some of the things that we would ask you to consider when you're deciding what was in someone's mind, what their intention was. One is a lack of provocation. And, what I would say to you is that this lack of provocation, a custody dispute is not something that should provoke or justify or excuse an attempted murder. Basically, LaTonya was at home in her bed that night, ignoring the defendant's calls, and that's not provocation either. She didn't want to see him. She wasn't threatening him. She was just at home, so she was not provoking him at that time. The defendant's conduct before and after the killing. Well, we can step all the way back to January 2nd or before, because I think he began to form, at least premeditate and think about it when LaTonya walked out on him and took the kids. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but I mean, on this day, his conduct before the killing, even though there was a domestic violence protective order in place, it was his idea to go there. Jeremy had no reason, hadn't brought it up. The defendant says, "You want to go see your mom?" He gets the gun, he goes to the church, he finds that she's not at the church, takes Jeremy somewhere else, and appears to not be particularly upset or particularly angry. Jeremy says he's quiet when they're driving over there. I'd submit to you that he's thinking about this. He's thinking about this thing he's going to do. He's thinking about LaTonya taking what's his by his own estimation, his children and his family, preventing him from having what he wants. And so you can consider that. And then after the killing, the defense has said he didn't mean to do this because he didn't get away. But, what I would say to you is that he left, he ditched his truck, he got a ride to his house, he reloaded his gun. We'll talk about that in a few more minutes. And he went and hid in the woods and, shot at some police officers when they when they found him with their canine unit. So you can consider that as to what was in his mind, what he intended to do when he went over there. Even telling his father to take care of the kids is because he knew that he had formed a plan. It doesn't have to be a good plan or a foolproof plan. It certainly wasn't. It was a terrible plan, but it was a plan. And so you can consider that. Previous difficulties between the defendant and the victim. Well, I'm certainly not going to belabor that. You've been taking notes. You've heard about their difficulties. Those are things that you can take and look and say, what did he mean to do? What did he mean to do when he went over there? He had threatened her. He had threatened her to Captain Taylor. I won't call him T. I'll call him Captain Taylor. Captain Taylor did not overreact when he talked to the defendant on January 2nd. And I don't believe, I believe that his testimony was absolutely credible in this case. You should believe it. And he certainly shouldn't be blamed for creating some sort of cascade of ill will that resulted in this violence, again, helping the defendant evade responsibility. Threats before and during the killing, you can look at the domestic violence protective order and refer to LaTanya's testimony about the threats he made to her on January 2nd and after. Blows dealt after the victim is helpless and nature of the wounds. Nature of the wounds is really important, folks. If you don't want to kill someone, but you want to shoot them in the foot. Shoot them in the shoulder or the buttocks. But he shot his wife in the chest and in the face. And she demonstrated it for Mr. Waller, and he was right up on her, inches away. That is a shot that tells you what's in his mind. I want to kill you. The shot to her face is a shot that tells you, I want to kill you. That is what is in my mind. That's what's on my mind. That's what I want to have happen. Again, it was a miracle that it didn't. This is the only piece of physical evidence I'm going to show you, but I think it demonstrates further the intent to kill. You heard Elizabeth Wilson from the State Crime Lab talk about the functionality of the gun, the High Point 380 that the defendant used. And you heard that LaTanya was shot twice there in the hallway or in the bedroom. Maybe she just bled in the bedroom or was beaten in the bedroom, but she was shot twice. And that the gun was working properly. Clearly, she was shot twice. Sylvester was shot 4 times, and Leah was shot once, so the gun was working properly. But this was found at in the bedroom on a secondary search, and that's the .380 caliber bullet that looks like it's got a big dent in the side. And she talked about user error, that it could have been because the way he was using the firearm, he hadn't locked his wrist and was limp-wristed, that maybe that was why, or that it had been misloaded. But 2 shots fired properly. I'd submit to you this is the 3rd shot. He wasn't done. And I'll also submit to you that you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bullets for Sylvester, 1 for Anglia, 2 for LaTanya in this 3rd. That's 8. He unloaded the clip. He got rid of every bullet. If he had 13, maybe he would have used all 13. If he hadn't been limp-wristed when he was shooting, maybe that bullet would have been inside her and she wouldn't have recovered. And then the tragedy would be even worse. But I show that to you because that further shows what his intention was. You don't shoot someone 3 times at such a close range unless you have formed in your mind an intent to kill them. He wanted her dead. You've heard the reasons. The evidence they've put on supports it. So again, we'd ask you to find him guilty of attempted first-degree murder of LaTanya Holden. And then, with regards to the assault, again, they have admitted to AWDWISI, or at least conceded it, it sounds like. If you believe what I'm telling you and what all of the evidence shows about his intent, then it'd be your duty to find him guilty of that as well. Now that we've talked about intent and we've talked about the nature of the assault, what I want to point out to you just about each of them is, again, you have to decide what's in someone's mind, and it's not impossible, and It can be done beyond a reasonable doubt. You heard from the medical examiner, I thought it was interesting that both LaTanya and her mother received the same injury, that their each heart was hit at the right ventricle, and needed to be, well, in LaTanya's case, needed to be repaired, and in Anglia's case ultimately led to her death. But the defendant was consistent in where he shot them. So if you believe he wanted LaTanya to die, he certainly wanted Anglia to die as well, and was able to execute that purpose. And then with Sylvester, he shot 4 times in the back. And then the medical examiner calls it the chest, but it's sort of on the side and in the front. His body's riddled with bullets. He was shot until he went down, and his body was filling up with blood in his chest cavity, restricting his lungs and preventing him from breathing. So, again, that's not to inflame you, although it will. It's just to show you that the nature of the assault can tell you what's in his head. The manner in which it was made, and everyone's talked about this, that he arrived at the residence of Lake Glad with a firearm, knowing that Sylvester Taylor had removed firearms from the residence. And whether he believed it or not, he came in there fully loaded and ready to shoot. He arrived unannounced. There was no call, there was no setup saying we're coming over. And all of the competent evidence shows that he immediately began shooting upon entering. And again, that it was unprovoked. Now, the judge will also instruct you that in order to find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, that he had malice. And he'll instruct you, I think, that the defendant intentionally and with malice killed the victim with a deadly weapon. And then it defines malice. It means not only hatred, ill will, or spite, as it's usually understood. To be sure, that is malice, but it also means the condition of mind that prompts a person to take the life of another intentionally, or to intentionally inflict a wound with a deadly weapon upon another, which proximately results in his or her death without just cause, excuse, or justification. We have all the malice here. Hatred, ill will, spite, regardless of whether he says that he wants to have counseling with LaTanya. Clearly his relationship with Sylvester is full of malice. But again, that's not the malice we need to prove, just the condition of mind that prompts a person to take the life of another. And I think the judge will also tell you you can infer malice from someone shooting someone with a gun. So we believe, again, all the credible evidence and all of the evidence supports this condition of mind. And again, the nature of the wounds, they're killing wounds. They're not warning shots like he shot at the dog, or they're not flesh wounds in the foot or the hand. These are killing wounds. This is where you shoot when it's your intention to take the life of another. Premeditation and deliberation. The judge will tell you that the defendant acted, that we would have to prove that the defendant acted after premeditation. That is, that the defendant formed the intent to kill the victim over some period of time, however short, before the defendant acted. However short, some period of time. You can premeditate, and he could have premeditated from the moment he pulled up to Lake Glad and the moment he saw Sylvester Taylor. He could have decided, I'm going to shoot that man. I've got a lot of problems with him. He could have done it all on April 9th. Now, we don't think he did. I mean, I think the evidence shows that he started premeditating this stuff back in January or earlier with regards to Sylvester and with regards to Anglia and LaTanya, because he blamed the three of them for taking his children from him and preventing him from having what he wanted. But again, it's however short. And so, we can break it down into that evening, and I'll do that with each of the victims as we go through their particular cases. And then that the defendant acted with deliberation. This is the one place where You may have heard a snippet of the law from the defendant, but in order to prove deliberation, the judge will tell you that the state must prove that the defendant acted with deliberation, which means the defendant acted while in a cool state of mind. You heard that part. What you didn't hear is this does not mean that there has to be a total absence of passion or emotion. If the intent to kill was formed with a fixed purpose, not under the influence of some suddenly aroused violent passion, it's immaterial that the defendant was in a state of passion or excited when the intent was carried into effect. I would imagine you would have to be pretty ramped up to shoot someone 4 times and then kill another person and kill another person. That's probably an emotional thing. And so the fact that he had tears in his eyes or was upset after the fact, probably because he realized he was guilty of first-degree murder and was going to be arrested and spend the rest of his life in prison at least, that doesn't matter. That's fine. He can still deliberate. The intent to kill was formed with a fixed purpose. Basically, he made a choice. He decided, in however short a period of time, that he wanted these people to die. That is supported by all the evidence of the nature of their wounds. That is supported by his prior dealings with Sylvester. I think you even heard some evidence that he had some ill will towards Anglia when she was not as supportive of him in his marriage as he would have liked. And again, I'm not going to belabor. You've seen the timeline. You know the facts. The intent is there for premeditation and deliberation. And again, some period of time, however short. So that means when he comes into the residence, and the doctor says we can't tell you the number or order of the shots, who was shot first, which shot to Sylvester landed first, but again, he could have come in, shot Sylvester, seen Anglia there, and in the time that he saw her, decided he was going to kill Sylvester, he could decide, I'm going to kill you too, because you're a part of the problem of the group of people that's in my way. In that amount of time, he could premeditate and form an intent and fix a purpose in his mind that would require you to find that we've satisfied that element and convict him of first-degree murder. Again, these are the sorts of things that you can consider in determining premeditation and deliberation. It's a sort of a form of intent. They're usually are usually not susceptible of direct proof. They be proved by proofs of circumstances, which by they may be inferred. And again, I would just point you to the manner in which the killing was done, the threats and declarations of the defendant beforehand, the conduct of the defendant before, during, and after the killing, and the lack of the provocation. And previous difficulties between the defendant and the victims. What does not constitute a defense? You will not hear, and no one has contended from the defense that the defendant acted in self-defense. You will not be instructed, and no one has contended that the defendant was insane. You have not been instructed, and no one has contended any of those offenses because they don't exist. And so what they're left with is basically making the state prove its case, which we feel like we've done. Threats made months before, custody issues, sadness, someone not returning your calls, someone not talking to you, someone not attending a birthday party, or being emotional are not defenses to first-degree murder. They aren't. And you shouldn't consider them. And you shouldn't feel that they have prevented the defendant from deliberating. Again, a cool state of mind does not mean the absence of passion or emotion. Of course, this was something that was emotional for everyone involved. However, there's nothing in evidence that would lead you to believe that he was incapable of fixing a purpose. In fact, everything he did seemed to be going to be fixed by that purpose of committing these murders. All of these things are examples of evidence which tend to show motive and support your finding of premeditation and deliberation. The defense even put it on. His half-brother talked yesterday about January 26th, and after whatever happened with Mr. Taylor at the drop-off, that the defendant and he were talking about going over there, and then decided not to because there was a protective order and he wanted to keep his job and the Lord was with him. Well, so what do you think they were going to do over there? It sounds like they were going to go kill Sylvester Taylor that day or shoot him. So again, that's over 2 months before the fact that this is being kicked around in his head. And the other thing I would say to you is nothing happened on April 9th. There are dates, January 2nd, January 26th, February 10th when there's a court hearing. JT's birthday party on the 5th, but what happened on the 9th? Nothing. She didn't return his phone calls, and that made him mad, and he was such an emotional mess that he could not fix a purpose in his head? No, he fixed a purpose in his head to kill her, and to kill Sylvester and Anglia because they were harboring her and holding his children hostage in his opinion. All of their evidence points to our motive. Sylvester Taylor was shot 4 times, 3 in the front, and again we mentioned the side, and once in the back. There's one wound that contains stippling and soot, meaning that it was done at close range. We don't know if that was the first shot or the last shot. There was a shot in the back, and the man was shot first in the kitchen, ran out the back door, knowing he was being shot at, knowing the defendant was there to kill him, and knowing that he didn't have a gun. And then he was shot in the side, and he died shortly thereafter in a bean field behind his house. And again, anything Sylvester said about the defendant or threatened to the defendant in the past was not provocation on April 9th. It is not a defense. The fact that your father-in-law doesn't like you gives you no right to go over there when he's unarmed and shoot him when there's no imminent threat of danger to others, and there wasn't. I won't belabor it. We're almost done. Anglia Taylor, first-degree murder, she certainly hadn't provoked him. But again, I would tell you that she was basically part of the big problem that the defendant had. That she was part of Team Taylor that was keeping his children away from him, keeping his wife away from him, and that he blamed them for that. Apparently because LaTanya couldn't decide for herself, although she had. His intent was to get rid of these people to pay for his sadness and his anger about something that he believed belonged to him. And our children don't belong to us. We're there to raise them and teach them how to make it through this life. But they were possessions to him. Jeremy Taylor, JT, had to testify, and that was a very hard thing to do. My heart breaks for that kid. He was in a rock and a hard place. His mom's sitting over here, his dad's sitting here, his dad's family is sitting here, his mom's family is sitting here. 16 years old. And he did fantastic. But you heard what he said, that he stayed with his dad to keep the peace. And that's not to say he didn't love his dad, or that he still does, but he felt that Mom could have the girls, and if he could go with that, everything would be okay. Rock in a hard place. And so he tried to keep the peace as long as he could. And then things continued because his dad had a problem with Sylvester and he had a problem with LaTanya and Anglia for keeping them away from him. And it helped him fix his purpose. And JT did say he loved his father. And how was he repaid? He was made the pawn. He was the defendant's entrance into that house. It was a lie. It was a subterfuge. JT, do you want to go see your mom? I'm not going to tell you, but I'm going to kill her, and I'm going to kill your grandparents. With you and the girls in the house. JT showed more courage and concern for his family than the defendant ever did. And Amber and Nautica needed him in the closet while he tried his best. The defendant tried his best to murder their mother. And then JT had to stay with her after he handed him the phone and a wallet with a little money in it and said 911 will be here in a minute. And he didn't stay with LaTanya. JT did. While she was gasping for air and became the man of that family. JT is not a coward. Again, before, during, and after the crime, here are some things that have come into evidence that the defendant has said that I would ask you to consider when deciding premeditation and deliberation. Again, he's a convicted first-degree murderer based on the evidence and the law that we've already talked about with first-degree murder, but we want you to touch all the bases too. On January 2nd, if I can't have the kids, no one will, to Uncle T. It's over now, to Uncle T. Intent, premeditation, deliberation. Who are the people that have the kids or are keeping him from having the kids? The 3 people at Lake Glad. In January, what would you think if your grandparents weren't around to JT? JT didn't answer. Didn't see it coming. But you know now that it was coming as far back as January. And then on April 9th, want to go see your mom? Again, JT said he didn't answer, but they went anyway. You can't talk to me. You can't talk to me. Someone's going to talk to me. To Sylvester and Anglia and LaTanya, who he felt deserved to die for not answering his phone calls that day. And then on April 11th, what's done is done. They got what they deserved to Lorna Haddix. They weren't trying to work things out. No one has asked how this has affected me. Sylvester and Anglia can't talk to him. They can't talk to LaTanya. They can't talk to Sylvester. They can't talk to their grandchildren, their other children. They can't talk to you and tell you what happened. They can't talk to anybody. And Amber and Nautica and JT, they can't talk to their grandparents either. But you can talk. You 12 jurors can talk. You can talk to the defendant today. They got what they deserve. What does the defendant deserve? This is not vengeance. He deserves a fair trial. He's gotten that. And he deserves a verdict reflecting the truth. You're going to give him that. Here's what you're going to say to him. We find you guilty of 1 count of attempted first-degree murder of LaTanya Holden, 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injury to LaTanya Holden.
Man, show me your authority. What your
1 count of first-degree murder of Sylvester Taylor
for these general statutes?
with premeditation and deliberation and pursuant to the felony murder rule,
You said
and 1 count
children.
of first-degree murder of Anglia Taylor pursuant to the felony murder rule and based on premeditation and deliberation. You're going to tell him that because it's the truth, because that's what happened. Thank you.
That's not what happened. Truth has not came out yet.
Thank you, Mr. Lively. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and then I'll bring you back and I'll read the jury instructions to you. That'll probably take about half an hour, and we'll break for lunch at that time, at which time you'll begin your deliberations. Just take 5 minutes to refresh yourselves.
What official
Leave your
charges I've been
notepads in
asking
the
for the
chair,
whole
we'll call
while?
all the
You
instructions
can't prove
out.
no official charges, can you? Can you show some official charges? Can you state that? Can you show me what Congress have allowed you power to do what you're doing? Can you show me what this is, none of this whole proceeding is unconstitutional? Can you show me that? Yeah, thought you'd get quiet. I respect it. One judge will. Somebody know the law.
We'll
Somebody
be in
respect the
recess for 5
Constitution.
minutes.
Recess, recess 5 minutes.
It's nasty. It's nasty.